painted for a long, long time, and I've enjoyed it, too. I paint the different seasons. I paint winter, and I paint spring and summer, but there's my favorite. I just love to paint summer.
America's favorite painter built his legacy on smiles, small towns, and Saturday evenings. But one painting shattered that image completely. When it was first revealed, newspapers refused to print it. Galleries turned it away, and families called it un-American. What could be so disturbing that even Norman Rockwell's loyal fans wanted it buried? Decades later, the truth behind that forbidden canvas has finally come to light, and it's nothing like the America he once painted. Because this time, Rockwell didn't paint comfort, he painted conscience. Behind the smiles. Norman Rockwell's paintings are stitched into America's memory. Picnics, parades, and families caught in the golden glow of a simpler time. But behind those familiar smiles was a man who didn't always feel he belonged in the world he painted. To understand the storm that would one day push him to create the most controversial painting of his life, you have to start with the quiet boy who used his art to survive. Rockwell was never the loud one in the room. He was pale, thin, awkward, and painfully shy. At school, he was often teased for being different. He didn't play sports, didn't fight back, and didn't quite fit the mold of the confident American boy he would later immortalize in his art. Drawing became his refuge. It was his way of escaping a world that made him feel small. Every sketch was controlled, every character a version of himself that people might finally like.
I'm an illustrator. I illustrate stories to magazine covers. This is quite different from a painter.
At home, things weren't easier. His parents rarely showed affection, and their house in Harlem was ruled by quiet restraint. His mother's strict religious beliefs clashed with his father's softer faith, leaving the home divided by silence. Norman often listened to his father read Charles Dickens aloud, stories about hardship and redemption that would shape his sense of empathy. Dickens painted with words. Rockwell would learn to do the same with a brush. When the family moved from New York City to the small town of Mamaroneck, Rockwell discovered the world that would later define his career. Neighbors waving, porches filled with laughter, and streets that smelled like summer. To everyone else, it was ordinary life. To him, it was magic. He began to paint not what was, but what he wished was real. That instinct to fix life on canvas became the foundation of his art. Rockwell was fully committed to painting by the time he was a teenager. He dropped out of school and attended the Art Students League in New York instead.
Rockwell enters Art Students League not to learn how to be a great painter in the manner of the Ashcan School. He goes straight to the illustrator classes.
He mastered the art of portraying not only human expressions and postures, but also warmth, which was the main reason that few illustrators would reach his level in terms of precision. The first professional pieces of the artist appeared in Boy's Life, the publication of the Boy Scouts of America, where his illustrations of adventure and friendship contributed to the shaping of a new national character. The Saturday Evening Post, the most powerful magazine in the nation, soon signed him up. His covers were always easy to spot, pure, funny, tender, and patriotic. They were the darlings of America. On the other hand, such renown brought about a cost that was not directly visible. The very ideal America that he depicted was a world where he could not actually live. He was going through a crisis in his marriage. He was suffering from poor health, and his mind was in a delicate state. During a session with a therapist, he would later divulge that every happy family he drew was his way of mending his own solitude. His well-known portrayals of beaming faces were not just paintings, they were therapy. They represented the illusion of acceptance that he never experienced. Rockwell was universally recognized as the embodiment of easygoing American life.
Not only was he talented, but he had the ability to knock this stuff out very early.
But on the other hand, this artist was experiencing panic attacks and a lack of confidence. His art was dishonest if the dream he sold had buried the truth in his mind. He was commonly the recipient of letters from presidents and critics alike, but still wondered if perhaps the world he painted was, in fact, not that kind. He would later on confess, "I painted life as I'd like it to be." And yet, deep down, that old truth remained. That silent war, the man who painted happiness while struggling with pain, was the ground of newness. After many years of mirroring America, Norman Rockwell would eventually flip the mirror. And when he finally did, the world wasn't ready to see what was staring back. Leaving the Post. For nearly half a century, the Saturday Evening Post had been Norman Rockwell's home. His covers weren't just magazine art, they were America's front porch, delivered to millions of mailboxes every week. Through the Great Depression, World War II, and the boom of the 1950s, his work became part of the nation's emotional wallpaper. But behind the glossy covers and happy scenes, Rockwell was suffocating. The world was changing fast, and his art, once seen as timeless, was starting to feel trapped in the past. By the early 1960s, Rockwell could see that the country he'd painted for decades no longer existed. The news was filled with marches, protests, and grief. Television showed brutal realities that didn't fit his trademark smile. And deep inside, he knew he couldn't keep painting picnics while the world was on fire. But the Post wouldn't let him change. The editors still wanted clean lawns, happy families, and polite laughter. They had strict rules about who could appear in his paintings. Black Americans, for example, were allowed only as background figures, maids, porters, or laborers, never as equals, never as the center of the story. That quiet censorship ate at him. Rockwell had always painted human decency, people trying to do the right thing. But now, decency meant telling the truth.
An important part of the American scene is a good cold glass of beer.
He was tired of painting a dream that ignored reality. "I painted life as I wished it was," he said, "but it's time I painted life as it is." The tension grew unbearable. By 1963, at the age of 69, Rockwell made a decision that shocked his publishers. He was leaving the Saturday Evening Post, the magazine that had made him famous. His leaving was not merely a professional change, it was this kind of ethical rupture. The Washington Post was the very representation of the secure and pristine America of the past. Rockwell was keen to portray the one that he was witnessing, the tangled, split, uncooked, and truthful one. He was ready to reveal the reality, even if it was not lovely. When Look magazine got in touch with him, providing him with total creative freedom, he was quick to act. The magazine was famed for its serious reporting and audacious photography, dealing with issues that the Post would not go near: civil rights, poverty, and politics. For the very first time in his life, Norman Rockwell was granted the right to portray the truth without any apologies. His pals were concerned. Why would a legend of 70 years take the risk of being remembered the wrong way just to get into the dispute? However, Rockwell didn't consider it a risk. He regarded it as a chance for renewal. After a long time spent on the romanticized side of America, he wanted to come out with the ugly truth. He desired to confront the segments of America that were being ignored by others, that had become ugly and uncomfortable.
Are reflected in their faces, and they represent the peoples of the earth, and if we could only all get together, everything would be hunky-dory.
In an interview, he said, "I wanted to paint the big things, the ones that hurt, rather simply." Rockwell, working in a modest studio in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, got rid of the old sketches that were hanging on his walls. The sketches of barbershop scenes and town parades disappeared. Now, the new concept began to materialize: scenes of bravery, fear, and fairness. He was opening a chapter that would challenge his body, soul, and fame. He realized that he was giving up a nice life for a rough one. And with one blank canvas in front of him, Norman Rockwell finally picked up his brush, not to please America, but to challenge it. The day he painted courage. It began quietly, with a single photograph clipped from a newspaper. A little girl, just 6 years old, was walking to school in New Orleans under the protection of U.S. Marshals. Her name was Ruby Bridges. She wasn't carrying a sign, a weapon, or even fear, just her school books and a stubborn kind of bravery. In 1960, she had become the first black child to integrate an all-white elementary school in the South. Norman Rockwell saw the photo years later, and it stopped him cold. It wasn't politics, it was humanity. That tiny figure against a blank wall was more powerful than any speech he'd ever heard. Rockwell began sketching obsessively. He drew not from imagination, but from conscience. For the first time, he didn't want to idealize America. He wanted to witness it. He stripped the image of all distractions. No crowd, no school, no background noise, just a wall splattered with a thrown tomato and the faint graffiti that spelled out America's ugliness in 1964. 4 marshals in dark suits walked beside the girl, their heads cropped out of the frame to keep every eye on her. The painting's title came naturally, The Problem We All Live With.
Very important painting in Norman Rockwell's career, which is called The Problem We All Live With.
He worked in silence for weeks, shutting himself away from phone calls, visitors, and even his family. He studied real marshals' uniforms, the exact rhythm of Ruby's step, and the way the light fell across the concrete wall. He wasn't chasing beauty, he was chasing truth. His brush strokes turned soft skin and cold brick into an indictment of the nation he had spent decades celebrating. When Rockwell completed the painting, it was a creation that no one had witnessed from him before. The warm colors and the playful, smiling faces had disappeared. Instead, the picture displayed a powerful, dignified, and fearful situation presented with innocence. It was no longer a fairy tale America. It was the true one. The artist had a long look at the finished canvas before deciding his feelings, pride or dread. He was well aware of the consequences Look magazine would face once the picture got printed. His prediction was correct. The reaction was very powerful indeed. While some readers considered it a brave act and praised him, literally thousands of them canceled their subscriptions the very next day. A tremendous number of letters arrived. Some of them were thankful, most of them were full of hatred. One reader from the South went as far as to say that Rockwell had ruined his legacy. Other people were accusing him of being a traitor. Rockwell kept silent. Actually, he did not have to say a word. The painting had already blown the trumpet of its voice. He confided in a friend, "If I lose all my fans, at least I have spoken the truth once." Those were the words that summed up his whole career. He had been a comfort maker for decades, but now he was a conscience bearer. This was an act of dissent for a painter who was famous for depicting smiling people and well-kept houses. The painting was not just a piece of art, it was a witness. Ruby Bridges, not knowing the uproar the painting would cause, later claimed she experienced no fear that day. But Rockwell's depiction of the event made the entire country feel what she had to endure. Silence, hatred, and bravery, all mixed in one delicate step. For Rockwell, it was a new beginning. And as the backlash raged, he began work on another canvas, one that would go even darker and nearly destroy him. The Backlash Machine. The outrage began before the ink was even dry, when Look magazine published The Problem We All Live With. In January 1964, Norman Rockwell's phone started ringing non-stop. At first, it was fellow artists congratulating him for his boldness. Then came the other calls, editors, advertisers, and lifelong fans asking what on earth he'd done. Some called the painting un-American. Others said he'd been tricked by radicals. The man who had spent decades painting the nation's virtues was now accused of betraying them. Hate mail poured in by the thousands. Some letters dripped with venom, others with disappointment. "I thought you were one of us," one reader wrote. "Now you've taken sides." Some were far darker. Anonymous notes that warned him to watch your step, and even a few that mentioned his sons by name. The same hands that once sent him thank you letters for cheerful Thanksgiving covers were now writing death threats. Rockwell read them all, then quietly folded them into a box and went back to painting. The Post, his former publisher, stayed silent, but the message was clear. He would never be welcome back. To the conservative heart of Middle America, Rockwell had broken an unspoken contract. He was supposed to make people feel good, not guilty. He was supposed to decorate their living rooms, not confront their consciences. Art critics could not reach a consensus, even inside the art world. A few of the critics considered Rockwell's move to be long overdue, while others brushed it aside as a marketing ploy. However, Rockwell was not after the limelight. He was giving up his sins. He had been thinking for a long time that his previous works, which presented Black Americans only as servants or people in the background, were bad and unworthy. He was aware that this new painting would not completely remove the past, but it could be a small step towards it. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said to his secretary. Nonetheless, the price was high on his personal life. Rockwell's anxiety was back, and this time it was even worse than before. He couldn't sleep, he lost his appetite, and stayed away from the public. His friends saw the same old symptoms of his breakdowns. He was a perfectionist, silent and isolated. Yet he did not give in to the depression and kept working. On the contrary, he transformed the rage into his upcoming artwork. Mississippi was the setting of the tragedy in that year.
Pictures of civil rights activists in the South who had been shot or injured.
The civil rights workers, whose names were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were slain during the process of registering black voters after being kidnapped first. Rockwell was greatly impacted by this news. He devoted 5 weeks to painting one single picture. 3 men in their last moments, surrounded by shadowy figures without faces that were holding torches. The artwork, Murder in Mississippi, was raw, bloody, and for the most part, too real for galleries to bear. Eventually, Look managed to get it published in 1965, and the backlash was even more drastic. Some people referred to it as obscene, others labeled it as propaganda. But for every single critic, there was someone who perceived the truth in it, the bravery of an artist who was already 70 years old and still not willing to turn away. Rockwell was no longer a kindly narrator of small-town America.
Norman Rockwell spent much of his life in New England, capturing the sweet and sentimental in small-town America.
He had turned into a more menacing figure, a reflection that the nation wished to remain blind to. However, despite the continuing rage and intimidation, something unanticipated occurred. A younger generation of artists started corresponding with him, not to debate, but to express their gratitude. Because by risking everything, Norman Rockwell had proved that art could still tell the truth. And that truth was about to outlive every headline that tried to bury it. From hidden to historic. For years after Norman Rockwell's death, his boldest paintings, especially The Problem We All Live With and Murder in Mississippi, sat in storage, quietly collecting dust. Museums favored the safe Rockwell, the boys fishing by the river, the Thanksgiving dinners, the scenes that felt like home. The others, the ones that stared too long at injustice, were considered too political, too heavy, or simply off-brand. The artist who had painted America's conscience was being edited again, this time by history itself. But time has a way of shifting what people are ready to see. By the late 1990s, scholars began to revisit Rockwell's final decade, and what they found changed his legacy forever. His later paintings weren't just illustrations, they were protest. And in them, critics finally saw what had been hidden all along. A man trying to reconcile a lifetime of idealism with a country that had outgrown its innocence. Those forgotten canvases weren't outliers, they were confessions. When The Problem We All Live With resurfaced in a 1999 traveling exhibition, audiences were stunned. The same painting that once caused cancellations now drew crowds. People stood in silence before the image of Ruby Bridges, realizing how quietly it still spoke. In 2011, something extraordinary happened. Ruby Bridges, then a grown woman, walked through the doors of the White House to see Rockwell's painting hanging on the wall outside the Oval Office. President Barack Obama stood beside her, both gazing at the little girl she used to be. For the first time in history, the painting was displayed not as controversially, but as courageous. The image that captured the moment circulated all over the internet, and in no time, the world was again reminded of what Rockwell had gone through for the sake of that picture. The picture that had once separated America had now united it, if only for a short time. Art museums hastened to reconsider his last works. Critics who in the past had branded him as a mere sentimental illustrator now referred to him as a conscience-driven storyteller. Rockwell had not depicted the ideal America. He had depicted the country's battle to improve. Among the newfound respect came a wave of disclosures. Private letters, therapy notes, and diaries revealed the extent of the cost of the change. He had to give up sponsors, friends, and even his own tranquility. But he always stood by the truth in painting. Perhaps, he wrote once, the world needs pictures of both, the way things are and the way they ought to be. This ambivalence became his hallmark and his salvation. In the 21st century, the painting, which had once been prohibited in the Southern galleries, was getting its share of attention from the classrooms. It was being examined in art history courses and even included in documentaries on civil rights. The same wall that had been defaced by hate slogans was now celebrated for its transformation into a wall of hope. Norman Rockwell was the artist who portrayed America at its best, and then at its worst. He has left us with a stacked-up trail of bravery that is hard to recognize, though, as mere color and light. If this story hit you, like the video, drop a comment with your take and subscribe for more deep dives into art that changed history. Watch the next video on your screen, another too honest picture that museums once tried to hide.